everybody, and thank you so much for joining the session today. My name is Amy Lightfoot, and I am the Director of Insight and Innovation for our English Programmes work at the British Council. I'm based in the UK. I have never had the chance to visit Brazil yet, but I very much hope to be able to come one day. And I hope you are all enjoying the ELT Week. I'd like to thank my colleagues for inviting me to speak. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you about a topic that I am very, very interested in and have done quite a bit of research around. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the Future of English programme, which you may have heard of before, either in this conference or outside of that. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of the programme, which is looking at multilingualism. So the Future of English, just to give you a bit of background about the programme, it's a multi-stage programme, and the aim is that it will set a research agenda which has a global scope but also local relevance. It's taking a cross-disciplinary approach and trying to reach very diverse audiences. It's also drawing on research and evidence and the expertise from a wide range of disciplines. Applied linguistics, assessment experts, practitioners, and those with experience in the classroom and in the wider field of English language teaching, and also experts who employ futures methodology. The three areas, three objectives, so you can see here on the slide, are that we're trying to provide insights on trends that will define the role of English as a global language over the next decade. We're also hoping to be able to inform language policy and education reform interventions where that's appropriate. And as I said before, to lay out a research agenda that's capable of generating hard evidence and data to help inform those policy decisions and evaluate their impact, and also to help teachers and practitioners with the decisions they're making in the classroom. So this isn't the first time that the British Council has considered the future of English. And in fact, the first time we considered the future of English, that time that we were looking at is now in the past. So the project was inspired by the work of David Graddol, who you may be familiar with. He wrote two books for the British Council, the first one in 1997 called The Future of English. And as I said, the future he was looking at was really round about now. And then there was a second one looking at English Next, called English Next, which was written in 2006. And in English Next, he went back to what he'd said in the Future of English initial publication to examine the current and potential future trends in English language teaching and learning. And so he was looking, as I said, about 15 years ahead, so around about now. So the idea was that we wanted to look at his predictions and see which ones had come true, which ones had he not got quite right, which ones were still a kind of work in progress. And so that was really the first phase of the Future of English programme that we have today. So there were three phases in total. That phase that I mentioned, reviewing what David Graddol had predicted in his English Next publication. And then we wanted to take those predictions and those ask our colleagues and our stakeholders and teachers that we know from around the world to discuss and reflect on those predictions together. So we held a series of round tables where we brought together a variety of different types of stakeholders, as I mentioned, looking to see what insights and opinions they had about these areas of prediction that David Graddol had made. And then based on the commentary that came out of those round tables, we analysed the people saying, see if we could pull out some further themes and ideas that were relevant now to the topic of the future of English. In phase three, the phase that we're in now, we're looking at new ways of engaging with global experts, players, academics, parents, teachers, employers, students, to try and see if we can look at how those trends might be developing, building evidence-based data sets, and also continuing to evaluate and interpret those trends over time. So we're setting up various research projects in this time to see if we can further those ideas. So the roundtables, sorry, I skipped ahead, there we go. The roundtables that I mentioned, there were 14 of those. They took place in July and December 2021, and they involved 92 different policymakers and influencers from 49 countries. And the idea was to try to get their views on the predictions that we've made, as I said, and to share their opinions with us. And for these roundtables, we did focus mainly on the policymakers and the influencers, which included academics, because we wanted to get an overview of the national and regional policy as well as practice that was taking place. As I said, though, there is a very strong voice for teachers and for learners to build into this, and that's where we are now, is kind of bringing all of this together and seeing if we can get even more voices to add to the debate and to share ideas. One of the conclusions from the round tables that we had, I think when we first went into them, we were thinking that we might be able to make a new series of predictions similar to the ones that David Graddle had made in English Next. But what we realized is that actually those predictions are very difficult to make. And the predictions that David Graddle had made had gone in different directions that he could never have imagined. And so actually it was more sensible and useful to develop a set of themes and questions which we could continue to explore together over the next couple of years. So all of the findings that came out of that are expressed really as a set of questions, which you can see here. And there are 8 different areas that we think have particular importance when you're considering the question of the future of English. You can see that there are questions about whether English will remain the world's most sought after language, whether the public and private sectors and how they play into the development and teaching and learning of English, the role that English plays in our multilingual reality, which I'm going to come back to. I'm going in the wrong numbers. Number 3, you can see there is the 4th one I'm saying. What is the role of English as a medium of education? How teachers will remain relevant in future English language learning systems, the role of English language assessment and how that is changing and whether that needs to change even more, the role of technology. I know that's a topic that many people are interested, particularly with the latest developments in AI. That's a particular area that we are also very interested in the British Council, and the impact that may have or has already had on English language teaching and learning. And then the final question you can see there about the extent that employment needs and the skills required for employment is driving the future of English. So those are the 8 questions. And if you've been to some of the other sessions that are focused on the future of English, this conference, you will have heard some more about some of those other themes already. So the one that I'm going to focus on today is about the role that English will play in our multilingual reality. If you are interested in the other questions and you haven't been able to go to sessions which are about them, you can always download the book. It's available for free to download from our website, and we'll provide you with the link, I'm sure, in the chat during this session so that you can get yourself a free copy of that. Okay. So moving on then to explore this question of multilingualism. So as you probably know what multilingualism means, but in a sort of sense, the use of multiple languages by individuals or societies, and it's really the norm in most contexts around the world now. People from all over the world find themselves living in communities or societies where multiple languages are used, and the reasons for this, I'm sure again you're aware of these, comes down to history of exploration, of colonization, of migration, and also globalization, which is one that is, all of those things come into play. Some of them have quite long historical roots, but as you know, globalization is a particularly key one, along with migration. I think it's also important to note about this term multilingualism and the different ways that people define it. So I know, for example, in Brazil, there are over 170 languages that are spoken, but also that Portuguese is the language that is spoken by the vast majority of the population. And I've also read that many people in Brazil only speak not any other languages. And so therefore, we might be able to say that Brazil is definitely a multilingual country, which I think probably we could say about most countries these days, but that a lot of people in Brazil would not consider themselves individually multilingual. And I think that's interesting because there are several definitions of the word multilingual. And in my research, I've been particularly interested in the broadest definition, which includes thinking about the different types of languages we speak within one language. So, for example, the language that you use in Portuguese or in English to write an academic paper is not the same language that you use if you're writing an email to your best friend. And the language that you use to write an email to your best friend is not the same as the language that you would use to write a WhatsApp or a Telegram message to your child or to another friend. The way that we use language depends on the context and also the audience that we're talking to. Anyone who, like me, has teenagers will also know that teenagers don't use the same language as their parents. So who you are, the age that you are, the context that you're in, the type of platform that you're using, all of these things will change the type of language that you choose to use. So I think it's important that as we continue through the session, we keep that very broad definition of multilingualism in mind. So English is often one of the languages that's used in multilingual situations. And as I'm sure you know, there are many different types of English that are used all over the world. People who have English as their first and only language are very much in the minority. So these days you could argue that the way that English is changing and is being shaped is much more as a result of people speaking it as a second, third, or fourth language. For the majority of people in the world, speaking perfect British or American English is not always the goal. The standards of British and American English are almost obsolete. And I think it's also important to point out here that this idea that anybody uses textbook standard British or American English is probably incorrect, even for people who are in the UK or in the USA. So, for example, I'm British, but my own use of English has been heavily influenced by the fact that I went to an American school and that I lived in India for many years. So vocabulary from those influences has definitely crept into my own language. My accent is a little bit strange because I went to an international school that was an American based. My own two sons speak English with a very different accent and using very different slang to the sons of my cousin who lives in the north of England. We live in the south. So this idea about there being a standard British English, I'm not even sure what it means these days outside of a book, a dictionary that will kind of determine what those standards are. I'm not sure how relevant it is to actual language use today. But I'm kind of digressing from the point. The point that I'm trying to make is that whoever is speaking in English, or indeed in any other language, wherever they are and whoever they are, the main aim is communication. The aim is to be what's saying is understood, rather than to be perfectly aligned to very specific rules. And it's definitely true to say that everyday communication is managed by individuals who are using what we call their own plurilingual competence, so their full range of languages. And within that, the different types of language within one language, as I've been explaining. So again, if we come back to my son, my 15-year-old son, so imagine he's on the phone to his friend and he is arranging to go to a party. And the time of the party clashes is at the same time as when he's supposed to go to work. While on the phone chatting to his friend, he's sending a WhatsApp message to his boss to ask if he can change his shift. So the language that he's using to joke around with his friend on the phone is not the same as the language that he's using in the WhatsApp message, at least I hope. And it's also not the same language that he uses when he explains to me what he's arranged and how he's going to do things differently. He's shifting between these different types of language almost at the same time. He's talking, he's writing, and then later he's talking to me, and he's mediating his way through all of these different types of language. And similarly, many teachers who are working in the English language teaching classroom will use their learners' first language to help them understand what they're learning. So they naturally will switch, maybe without even thinking about it, between English and Portuguese to explain a grammar point. Perhaps the speaking activity might be done in English, but the feedback from the teacher is given in Portuguese to make sure that the students understand. And the emphasis in the feedback is quite often going to be on whether they were communicating effectively, not whether their grammar was perfect, but whether they were able to convey the information that they needed to convey. So the objective being that they need to communicate successfully in the specific situations. Whether there's a mistake here or there, at the end of the day, is not as important as whether they've communicated that message. So this shifting kind of seamlessly between languages is sometimes referred to as translanguaging. That might be a term that you've heard or that you're familiar with. And translanguaging basically means that we are using all of the linguistic resources that we have available to us, and that this is how we communicate naturally, as I've described, you know, in all of our daily lives, no matter whether you're using one language as it's defined, you know, just English or just Portuguese, within that language, you are shifting and changing in different types of language use all the time. And that's also a form of translanguaging between language, ways of using a single language as well as between different languages. This is also increasingly how teachers and their students are communicating in English classrooms. So we'll have a little look at that. Understandably, and this has always been the case, classrooms often mirror the multilingual social reality in which they're situated. They mirror the reality in the world, but in particular in terms of the languages that are being used. And the teachers and the learners use the languages that are available to them to enable effective learning. However, some of you might be listening to this and thinking, okay, but you've just said maybe a teacher is using Portuguese to explain something in English, but in my experience, we're not supposed to do that. I've been told by my supervisor or head teacher or whoever that we're not actually supposed to use any Portuguese in the classroom. We have to use English. This is something that I've seen many times. But I think that's starting to change a bit. I think there is a realization that there is a lot of benefit and value to bringing the students' first language as in a way as productive, and that students still have an opportunity to experiment with and practice with the language, in this case, English, that they are learning. There are also sometimes in some countries policies around whether or not languages, other languages can be used in the English classroom. And these are starting to kind of emerge and be challenged a little bit, which I think is the right thing. So as I've said, there's an increasing awareness that is, you know, it's not just an idea, it's based on evidence that is coming out from the research, that there are many benefits to using translanguaging in education. But in order for those benefits to become more widespread in future, there are really two major changes that need to happen. So the first one is that education policies need to be adapted to include multilingualism and this idea of translanguaging as integral components. So it is, if you like, kind of championed as a positive thing to make the most of students' linguistic resources when they're learning. But also teachers will need training and ongoing professional development to help them to deliver the curriculum that supports the simultaneous use of multiple languages in the classroom to aid learning. And that training is really important to see, you know, when does it make the most sense to use one language? When does it make the most sense to use another? How can you use those languages together to optimize the students' learning? This idea of bringing changes to the policy is obviously complex and challenging. And there needs to also be some social consensus and buy-in from the public to do this, because in some cases, in some contexts, I don't know about in Brazil, but I've seen in other contexts that there is pressure from parents for there to be an English-only policy in the classroom, for example. So some of these ideas about the benefits that it brings to use the students' home languages in the classroom also needs to be communicated to the learners, the parents, and also to the wider communities. There needs to be a kind of balance between the local linguistic practice. In some cases, it's also particularly important because it helps to preserve heritage and to empower Indigenous languages as well, by allowing those languages to be used in the classroom. And also thinking about what the kind of wider economic requirements are in terms of different languages being developed to certain levels by the students so that they have those skills to take with them when they leave school. Languages can support each other to bolster overall educational progress, but as I've been saying, teachers and schools really need some clear guidance about how to do this. And as I said, really it's important that we have support and training in place to help teachers and head teachers and others that they work with. This doesn't necessarily come cheaply or easily. There is definitely investment that's needed to make sure that you have the resources in place. I've already talked about development, but also, developing resources and classroom materials that can also bring out the benefits of using multiple languages. And it might require a review of the pedagogy that is being taught in pre-service institutions as well, and making sure that teachers are coming out of that initial training with ideas of how they can most appropriately use different languages in the classroom, even when they have one language that is meant to be the focus of learning. Just a final point here, I think I've said about parents needing to be on board and informed, and various other stakeholders that need to be consulted and to have some training on the reasons for making these changes. The other thing I think to bear in mind is that, for all the stakeholders who are involved in these decisions, they're going to want to see what the impact of those changes might be, or the impact of doing things in a different way. So we need to also be thinking about how we can demonstrate whether or not there have been improvements, which often will come down to assessment. But to the learners themselves, how do they feel about the languages that they're learning? How do they feel about the way that languages are being used in the classroom? I think it's quite interesting to ask those questions. So all of this is not to try and say that it's just an easy thing to tell everybody, to tell teachers, oh yes, you can use whatever language you like in the classroom. It's obviously more complex than that, and there are various levels of conversation that need to be had through the education system in order for this to become a possibility and to be used effectively to achieve what we all want to achieve, which is that students learn as well as they can and come out of school with the skills that they need and the communication ability to do whatever it is that they want to do and to contribute to the country. I think that what I've just described there kind of relates to this diagram that you can see here. So this is from Professor Barry O'Sullivan, the idea of a comprehensive learning system. And it's the idea that you can't change one of these things without taking into account what's happening in the other element. So the curriculum needs to be considered, the delivery of teaching in the classroom, and also any assessment. And when we talk about using multilingual approaches in the classroom, all of those things need to be in alignment, and with, as you can see there, with some agreement around what policy standards are in order for that to function well. Okay. So just to finish off then, this question that I asked at the beginning, and the question that is one of the 8 that we have identified for the Future of English programme: what role will English play in our multilingual reality? I think it's safe to say that English will continue to play an important role in education, increasingly alongside other languages as the languages are developed together. And also as the way that English is being used, both in the classroom and outside, the way that it's taught will also need to be adapted, and also the way that it is assessed will need to be considered. And I think, based on the ideas and the opinions that we're gathering from the different people that we're speaking to around the world, it doesn't seem as if English as a foreign language is going to disappear, but that there is definitely some changes that need to be considered and thought about for teachers and within all levels of the system, about what it means for English when there are more and more people living in a multilingual context. There are more and more people living and using languages in multiple different ways that I was describing before. So I think all of these things, I'm not trying to answer the question here, but I think all of these things need to be considered as we start to continue the conversation around this, and for you to think about what this means in your context. Okay, so I think I am going to finish there. Hopefully a link to book for you to download. You can scan it from the QR code that's on the slide there, or hopefully you can download from the link that I hope will be put in the chat for this. Also, we have another book at the British Council, which is called Using Multilingual Approaches, which goes into some more detail about the issues around using different languages in the classroom. And it has a whole set of activities and ideas and lessons that you could explore as well, where it shows how different languages can be used together to improve learning and to complement each other. So yeah, I hope we'll be able to put a link in the chat for that one as well for you. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. I'm really sorry that because of the time zone difference, I'm not able to join with your Q&A session today, but I hope you have a good discussion. And if you would like to have a conversation with me about it or email, please do go ahead. I'm very happy for my colleagues to share my email address with you if you'd like to get in touch, or you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Amy Lightfoot. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Very best.